Hello. Thank you for joining the workshop today. If you're watching on YouTube, whatever day that may be, this workshop is on writing quality exegesis papers and citing scripture. So I am going to have it divided into two parts. The first part of this being the citing scripture side. And so I'm going to start with resources and technicalities and writing out actual biblical references and how to do just the technicalities of quoting, when to use commas, semicolons, colons, and that sort of thing. The second half of this, what I think might be the more fun half, is the tips and tricks. So this is the writing a quality exegesis paper part. So at that point, I'm going to be talking about thesis development, about how to focus in on the passage that you are wanting to write on, and also about commentaries and sources, when to use them, how to use them, how many are recommended to be used. So the first part of this, let's start with resources. So this is our website at the top, sbtswriting.squarespace.com/general resources. It's one of the two Writing Center websites. And on this website, I just want to point to two PDFs that you will find. So one is Biblical References and Translation. That is the title of it. And that contains tips on style, including punctuation and abbreviations. It also gives you different tips on how to cite within the text. It also tells you about the more complicated versions of this. So when to use semicolons and colons and some odds and ends if you have really complicated citation formatting issues. I'm going to cover some of those here, but just so you know, it has some different ones that I will not be talking about. The second option that I'm giving is the manual of style. No workshop is complete without talking about the SBTS manual of style. And so I'm just highlighting two major sections of this. One has the abbreviations for biblical books, GEN for Genesis, or John for Book of John, things like that. It also will have abbreviations for other texts, ancient texts, some more modern ones. And then I also am putting section 4.6 on there because that explains numbering. So when to use actual numerals, when to write it out as first FIRST rather than just the number one, and things like that. The more detail is obviously going to be in the first reference. The manual style really is just going to give you this broad framework to say, use it in this way, and then you need to figure out which instance you are in. And so you can decide if you need to go with option A or option B or option C. It doesn't give you a whole lot of details of how to decide which format you need to use. That's the Bible references and translation one. So moving on from resources, technicalities, I'm first starting with citation style and a few basics. So this one is really obvious. That's why I put them all together up here at the top. For biblical abbreviations, always parenthetical, always make sure you're using the correct abbreviation. There's no abbreviation period, and you always want to put it before the sentence period. So I gave three examples of this. The first one, Jesus wept. You can see I have the quotation marks around the actual quote, Jesus wept. And then I have the parentheses and I have the sentence period at the end. I don't put the period after wept, and before the parentheses, I always put it after my citation. The other part of this, you'll notice that I have the whole book written out, John, John. Surprisingly enough, that is the abbreviation for the book of John. So when you're citing that book, just know it is not JN or JHN, it is the full title. The second one, the Bible starts with creation. and I'm citing Genesis 1. This is not a quote, so I figured I'd use something that is just a summary, so there's no quotation marks in this one. And you can see I have it as Gen, G-E-N, because that is the short form of Genesis. And I do not have a period. There are some formats that require GEN period, the number 1. We do not want a period in there. So that's the SBTS way of doing it. No period within those biblical abbreviations. Again, like before, you see that the period comes after the parentheses. And then the third one, Samson liked honey, and that's from Judges 14, 8 through 9. Again, that is a very loose summary of Judges 14. But you can see I put in the abbreviation JUDG. The reason that I included this one was not just to show that I don't have a period in there, but to show that some of the abbreviations have more than one option. So you always want to double check what the SBTS option is. There are many people, and honestly, academic journals or books that will use JDG. They cut the U out of it, but we do not. So the two PDFs that I had referenced in the last slide will definitely be helpful with that. They have just a long list of all the biblical books and how you should abbreviate them. I know it seems minor, but as the people who are reading and writing these all the time, we can see if you're using the wrong abbreviations. By we, I mean probably your professor. So those are the basics. I do want to dig a little bit deeper than that because I feel like we all know generally that they should be in parentheses, but there is so much more to be said about it. So a little bit deeper. Ordering and punctuation from multiple passages. So it's easy to look up just your biblical book abbreviation and throw it in parentheses, but what happens when you are referencing many more passages than just one? So I cited Isaiah 5:5, John 1:2, 6:3, Acts 1:2, 12, and then chapter 10, verse 5. If you're wondering what the theme is between those verses, or you're looking them up and confused, there is no theme at all. I chose these passages just at random, whatever numbers felt good to me at the time. So please do not waste your time trying to find any sort of coherence between the books that I cited. So the first part of this, canonical order. You'll see that I cited it Isaiah, John, Acts. I did not cite it John, Isaiah, Acts. You always want to do it canonical order. To that, anticipating any questions, as I am an Old Testament student here, it is the English canonical order that we're talking about. So please do not cite them with Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, law, prophets, other writings. That's not the order we use. We use our English translation order. So canonical order. The second note I have on there is commas between verses and chapters. So I have those highlighted in green. Hopefully that's easy to see on wherever you're watching this. So John 1 verse 2, comma 6 verse 3, or Acts 1 verse 2 and then verse 12. So the commas are just to say that they are part of the same book. Now there's a sub point on there, that semicolon, that's light blue, and it's in Acts. And I have the semicolon when multiple verses and chapters are cited. So if you look back at John 1, 2, and 6, 3, I'm only citing one verse in each chapter. So it's pretty clear for someone reading it that 6 verse 3 is just a new chapter and a new verse. But if you're looking at Acts, I have Acts chapter 1, verse 2, and then verse 12. Well, then when I cite a new chapter, I need something to signal my reader that I'm doing a different chapter. Because otherwise, you might think that I have a typo. Maybe I mean also verse 10 and verse 5. I don't know. But I want to be able to signal, yes, these two verses are from chapter 1. now I'm looking at a new chapter. So that is when you'd want to throw in the semicolon, is just if you have a fairly complicated one with multiple verses in a single chapter and then followed by a different chapter. And then the other pretty obvious one, semicolons between books to show that the books are different. So Isaiah 5:5, semicolon, John 1:2. And the most common ones you're probably going to use will be the commas between the verses and chapters, and then the semicolons between the books. Unless you really get into the weeds and want to cite a whole bunch of verses and then jump to a new chapter and cite a whole bunch of verses. So a little deeper on the citation style, I do have more on that one. N dash or hyphen. So if you're wondering what the N dash is, for me on a PC, that is the control button and then the minus sign. My minus sign is up in the top right. So N dash or a hyphen, when to use which one? So the rule of thumb, hyphens are for verses and dashes are for chapters. Remember, I'm talking specifically about biblical books here. So the dashes are also for page numbers, but that's a separate thing. You're going to be citing verse and chapter numbers in biblical text, not page numbers, right? So rule of thumb, hyphens are for verses, dashes are for chapters. So Genesis 1 to 3, chapters 1 to chapters 3, I have the long N dash. Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 to 3, I have just the short hyphen. So that's just another way that it helps your reader distinguish between what you are referring to. Thinking about even if you don't say the book name, if you're just saying in 1 to 3, God builds or God creates, right? Well, if I have 1 dash 3, then I know, oh, we're talking about chapters 1 to 3. If I have 1 hyphen 3, then I'm like, oh, you mean verses 1 to 3, and we're still in the same chapter that maybe you started your paragraph out in. Hopefully you don't write that obscurely and you actually say verses 1 to 3 or chapters 1 to 3, but it just helps to really identify which one you're talking about, even in the style of your hyphens and your dashes. Everything that makes it clear is always better. Then the two on the bottom here, confer and the little railroad tracks, the 2 slashes. So CF actually stands for confer. There's a Latin word behind it, but I am not a Latin professional, so just know it as confer. Confer is to say these verses are related to the one you're citing. So let's say I'm writing a paper on Galatians, the book of Galatians. And in one of my sentences, I say, Paul claimed that Abraham believed. And so I cite it as Galatians chapter 3, verse 6. Well, I can use the CF to say, yeah, this Abraham believed and it was credited to him as righteousness is also found in Genesis 15:6 and also in Romans 4:3. You'll probably use this a lot more when you're actually citing the verse. You cite the verse in one spot and then you confer other verses that are thematically or grammatically similar. I'm doing this on a slide, so I didn't have a ton of space to put huge citations in, and that would just get cluttered for all of us. But that is normally how you would use it. So if you were to say, like, Jesus calls himself the true light, and you want to cite that in one passage, well, you can confer with other passages that are about the Messiah and light, or God being light. And that is a way to say that you have a full breadth of knowledge of the passages that are out there and related. Do not overuse that. That's my caution. Because there is so much interrelated information in the Bible, you can be tempted to confer constantly. Use that when necessary. Don't use that for every citation. You will have way too many references that will distract your reader. The second one here, those little train tracks going on, the 2 slashes, Egypt is a broken reed. So that's the actual phrasing, and it's talking about Isaiah's prophecy. Do not lean on Egypt, because they are like a broken reed that pierces the hand, as they are about to be invaded by Assyria or Babylon, sorry. So Egypt is a broken reed. This is 2 Kings 18. This is Isaiah 36 as well. So the two lines are to say that these are parallel passages. Parallel lines, right? So these parallel passages, this works really well when you are citing from like Samuel Kings and have parallel passages in, let's say, Chronicles, or if you're looking at especially the synoptic gospels, but sometimes also John, when you have wording that is identical or nearly identical. In the Pentateuch, sometimes the laws overlap between Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and occasionally Deuteronomy. So that's what those two lines are for. That's a very specific time. There aren't going to be a ton of quotations that you will have where the passages are worded identical or nearly identical. So just know you probably aren't going to use that very often. But it is an option, and it is a way to just say you're aware that this is found in two places. Both of these, the confer and the two parallel lines, are not always necessary. You can use them, it can be helpful, but if your argument, for example, in the first one is coming from Galatians, it may not be necessary to show the other sources. It could be helpful, but it may not be necessary. You may find that that just clutters up your paper and it's easier just to leave them out because it's not closely related. The same thing with the parallel passages. If you are writing a paper on 2 Kings, you may find it helpful to say that Isaiah is parallel, but that may not be related to what you're saying. Maybe you're looking strictly at the grammar of 2 Kings 18, and you don't want to do any comparison with Isaiah. Leave it out. Not that big of a deal. It can be helpful, can be useful, but those are less necessary. Let's move on here. Quotation style. So the last one was citation style. This is about the actual sentence. So comma, colon, or quotation marks. I have 3 different examples with 3 different punctuation options. So the first one, David was a man after his own heart, from 1 Samuel. So you will see I do not have a comma or a colon at that point. The reason being that the passage runs directly into the sentence. So David was a man after his own heart. There's no pause. There's no clause that introduces the quote. I have worked it in as though it's just one single unified sentence. The second one is my contrast to that. Moses told the Israelites, go to the hill country of the Amorites, Deuteronomy. So in this case, Moses told the Israelites is an introductory phrase. It gets a comma because it's not running directly into that passage, but introducing it. It would work the same if I said, and in the Bible, it is stated, go to the hill country. Or Deuteronomy 1:7 claims, go to the hill country of the Amorites. However I want to do that, when I am introducing the actual quote, I have a short introductory clause, I use a comma. If the quote itself doesn't have an introductory clause but just runs into the sentence, no comma necessary. So the last one, and this one's less common than those two, the soldiers mocked Jesus, colon, hail King of the Jews, from John 19. So the reason I'm using a colon in that one is that the sentence, the first half of the sentence, can stand on its own. So the soldiers mock Jesus, period, works just fine. That is a perfectly correct, grammatically in tune sentence. Unlike the last one, Moses told the Israelites, period doesn't work there. It's missing something, right? So if you're reading your introduction to your quote and it doesn't really make a sentence, if you say it out loud to yourself and you're like, ooh, something is missing, you need a comma. If you're reading the introduction to your quote and it reads like a sentence all on its own, you can put a period and be happy, then it gets a colon. If you read the first part of your sentence and it doesn't even really have an introduction at all, David was a man after his own heart. David is like not even a clause. Then you don't put any punctuation there at all. So if I were to rank these as to what are most commonly used in writing that I've seen, or my own writing even for natural English speakers here, Moses told the Israelites, comma, go to the hill country of the Amorites, far and away the most common. Most native English speakers will use an introductory clause before their quote. A distant second would be the first one. David was a man after his own heart, with no need for any punctuation there. And then the third level one is the colon. Soldiers mock Jesus. Now, I will say our most common mistake, this is mine included, is to try to put a colon in when you need a comma. So just be aware, colons are if you have a full sentence at the beginning. So if you put a colon in and then you read that first half of your sentence and it doesn't read like a full sentence, it should be switched to a comma. That is probably the most common mistake that is made in this quotation style. So the next part of the quotation style, write out the first word of the sentence. This is true generally. So if you're saying first, second, third in your academic writing, you do not do 1, 2, 3. You write out the words first, second, third. The same thing goes for biblical books. So 1 Corinthians is a good book is not 1 Corinthians. It's first. On the flip side of that, he read 1 Corinthians is just the number 1. So whatever book that you are citing here, whether it's 2 Samuel or 2 Peter, you always want to write out the word when it's the first word of the sentence, but then just use the number when it is anywhere else in the sentence. The other part of this that I need to touch on, always write out the biblical book within your sentence. So in the 2 examples that I gave, I did not say he read 1 COR. COR is the abbreviation for Corinthians if I'm in parentheses. So in your citation, when you're in the parentheses, always abbreviate it. It would always be 1 COR and then the book and then the chapter number. But when it's in the sentence, it's always the full name of the book, never that short form. The second part on here, transliterations are italicized, but it is recommended to use Hebrew and Greek fonts. So that's from the SBTS Manual of Style 4.11. That gives you the transliteration options. SBL Biblit font for Greek and Hebrew, according to the Manual of Style 1.2, is the one that you should be using. It also has a link to the SBL website where you can download the fonts and the keyboards so that you can actually put them into your Word document or whatever writing software you're using. So transliterations are italicized, Hebrew and Greek are recommended. My point is to say, when you're transliterating, you do not want to put it in quotation marks. It's always italics, not quoted. The other part of this, make sure you're using our transliteration style. So there's a table in that 4.11 of the manual style that shows what the transliteration should be. There are some people who use much more complicated styles. Certain books and journals will use ones that have all sorts of lines and dots below letters to distinguish between a sharp S sound and a softer S sound. Good luck having me explain what that is, but sin versus Samic in Hebrew are sometimes written differently with these little diacritical marks, and the vowels are written with marks above them to show if it's a long A versus a short A and those sorts of things. We have a very, very simple version of this. Use our simplified version. Don't worry about those complicated other versions that you may see out in other journals and books. So I wrote at the bottom, kara in the Hebrew and the Latin alphabet, and Hebrew's read backwards. So the one that looks like a backwards Q is the Q sound. The one that looks like a backwards R is the R sound. And then the aleph, being the little X, is what gets that little apostrophe up there. So kara being both written in SBL Biblit font, also transliterated and italicized. Also, if you're wondering why I chose that word, it means to read or to call. Thought it was apt. So the next part, resources on translations. So here are some suggestions that I'm going to give and my reasons why. I got this actual chart that you see at the bottom from the Logos website that I am citing at the top. You could also look at F.F. Bruce's English Bible, A History of Translations. I was required to read that when I was in college doing a biblical studies major. No, I was not in college in 1961, but it is still a popular book, and a lot of people still reference it. It has a similar graph in there. It also goes a lot more into detail about the history of the translations and which translations are good for what different uses. So if you look on there, the formal equivalent or literal ones versus the functional or dynamic equivalent. So you have like your New American Standard, your NASB is way on the literal. You have RSV is over there. King James is pretty far over there as well. The NIV is pretty dead center in that. And then you have things like the New Living Translation being farther over to your dynamic side. So the recommendations I'm going to give will be about academic writing. I am not trying to ruin anyone's favorite translation. By all means, use whatever translation you want for your own personal study or in the church. That is fine. This is strictly going to be about academic writing. So, what is our goal in academics? Our goal is clear and accurate. So the question is, what translations will help us accomplish clear and accurate writing? Emphasis on accurate. So things that I would not use, the King James and the New King James. First, because they use archaic English, especially the King James Version. Even the words that you recognize may have a different sense than what you think they have because they're from the 1600s. Just like awful at one point meant to be full of awe as a positive rather than terrible. I would never say something is awful in a positive aspect, but originally that was the meaning of the English word. So archaic English. The other part of this is that they use the Textus Receptus and not an eclectic text. I don't want to go into a bunch of detail on the received text, but just know that this is a late text that has a lot of issues with it. There's a lot of additions and unique features of that text that are not found in the earliest manuscripts and papyrus. So it is questionable at best. Do some Googling, read something else. I don't want to go deeply into that, but just know it is based on a different text. NIV. This one I've seen cited a lot. I recommend against it. It's clear English, but it's less literal. It's more of a dynamic translation. And for academic writing, that's a negative. For your own personal reading, that may be great. For academic writing, it's not as positive. The New Living Translation is one that I've seen a little less, but I have seen it in academic writing. I also would be avoiding this one because this takes dynamic to even another level than the NIV. So one of the reasons why you want to look at literal is that our focus is on what the original language is saying. So when you get things that are easier to read, like the NIV or the New Living Translation, they are moving around clauses, they are rewording things that may be unclear in the Hebrew or in the Greek. They'll try to make it clear for the reader, or things that are worded strangely, or at least strangely to us in the Hebrew and Greek, they'll try to flatten out. They make it into good English. Well, the problem then is that I don't know what the actual Hebrew and Greek originally said. It also is a challenge because they might be making theological choices when they are moving these phrases around. They are emphasizing one thing and not another, or rewording it to make a theological point that they think might be in the text, but might not clearly be in the original text. Again, this is an issue for your academics because you want to see clear and you want to see accurate. So better translations. RSV, the Revised Standard, NASB, the New American Standard, and ESV, the English Standard Version. These are the most literal and really the modern versions. And these are also the ones most commonly used in academic journals. That is, unless the person is translating on their own. You will see these used a lot in academics, and I would recommend that we all use them in our academic writing here because it tells you fairly precisely what is happening in the Hebrew and Greek. I can put up one of those English translations next to my Hebrew text or my Greek text and almost be able to match up the words in most places. Then the last part of this, cite the translation in your first quotation. So Genesis 1:1 states in the beginning. And this is my quote in the beginning. I know it's not great, but remember, I'm trying to have some space on my PowerPoint slide. In the beginning, and then I have NASB. The second quote, the Bible begins with in the beginning, Genesis 1:1 NASB, is the same thing. The only difference is that quote, I don't say the reference in the passage, right? The first one, I say Genesis 1:1 at the beginning of the sentence. So all I need to do is cite the actual translation. The second one, I just say the Bible. So I need to cite both the biblical reference and the translation. Again, please let me emphasize, this is in your first quotation. So if you are just summarizing biblical text, a summary doesn't use a translation, at least not explicitly use a translation. So you wouldn't cite it there. It's only when you first start quoting. The other option I have at the bottom, which I don't always prefer, but you may like it, you can put a footnote. So your first quotation, you then put a footnote and say, unless otherwise noted, all Bible quotations come from, insert your citation or your preferred translation there. Let me also say, when I'm recommending to use RSV, NASB, or ESV, I am not saying to never reference the other translations. If you're doing a comparative analysis, by all means, cite a whole bunch of different translations and say, this one's good, this one's bad, here's where this translation's falling short. And in that case, use a variety. If you are trying to say that the translation you're using has the word wrong and this other translation has the word translated better, by all means, use another translation. But for your base translation, what you are going to use as the foundation throughout your paper, you will most likely want to choose one of these three, and you will probably want to stick with it all the way through. If you start out using the NASB and then halfway through the paper, all of a sudden you're citing the RSV or the ESV, your reader will be wondering why, and you'll want to tell them. And if there's a reason, be open about it. The NASB was really good until verse 6, and now I'm going to be citing the RSV because in verse 6, they just botched their translation for whatever reason. So pick a good translation, stick with it all the way through. If you feel like they missed something in their translation, feel free to change, but always make sure that you're clear why you're changing to a different translation. So then tips and tricks. So I'm going to touch on all three of these a little bit deeper, but here I just want to introduce to you where we are going. So thesis development. Number 1, narrow to broad. Don't argue from the whole canon. I've seen this many times. You do not want to draw in, narrow to broad. Don't argue from the whole canon. Oftentimes we want to draw in text from all over, but that is not the right way to argue. Stick with the text that you're dealing with before you start drawing in outside information. Just the same as you don't want to go straight to systematic theology when you're trying to do an exegesis of a passage. Let the passage speak on its own, and then maybe later you can bring in text outside of that particular passage. Even with that, there are professors who may ask you to then draw in the whole canon, or you do an exegesis of an Old Testament passage and then you point to Christ, or you bring in systematic theology, and that's great, but make sure you exegete the passage before you draw those things in. And then narrow to broad, select the right text size. I will be very honest with you, if you are writing a 10 to 15 page paper, the chances are very low that you can do an entire biblical chapter in 10 to 15 pages. I mean, most chapters are what, 20, 30 verses, and that would mean that you're doing 2 to 3 verses at least per page to fully explain them and put them into a full context with the surrounding verses. So select the right text size. That not only goes for the length of text, but make sure that it also is the right text size for what's happening in there. Don't split up a parable of Jesus, but also don't put in 2 parables of Jesus, right? Don't start with one movement in the Old Testament of the Exodus, where, like, let's say they travel from the Red Sea to Sinai. Don't split that movement up, but also don't then include things from before the Red Sea or what's happening at Sinai. Make sure that your text size has just one major literary passage and also is not too large or too small for the amount of page numbers that you're doing. I will tell you as well, if you're looking at commentaries, a lot of commentaries will segment the text for you, and it'll be very helpful for you to see where literary sections start and end, and that can help to guide you on what the right text size is for you. Side note, this is for those who do not have them chosen. If your professor has a list of 4 or 5 passages and says choose one of these and write your paper, obviously they have chosen the right text size for you. Number 2, always prove your claim. Don't assume your reading of the passage. We, me included, like to think that we read our Bibles well, and let me tell you, we don't. When you are reading your Bible, you may be thinking that you have the only interpretation possible. I'm quite certain that you don't, otherwise we would not have all of the commentaries that are out there. So always prove your claim. Look at what other people are saying. Make sure that you are reading the passage in all of the depth and clarity that you need. I cite commentaries. Everyone cites commentaries. Don't oversight, don't undercite. Number 3 on here. Don't oversight, don't undercite. This is more of a stylistic thing. And again, I'm going to jump into this later. If you must err on oversighting, but just be aware, if you are putting in tons of biblical citations, especially in weird places, it can be very tricky for your reader to follow what your sentence is saying. But at the same time, if you don't cite enough, your reader won't follow what you're saying because we won't know what verse you're in either. So, like I said, I'm going to jump into these and I will start that right now. And I'm going to actually go through these with an example. So the first part, narrow to broad. So let's say we're doing an exegesis on Genesis 1, verses 26 through 31. This is one of the passages that say, let us make man in our own image. I'm going to briefly skim it for you just so we're all on the same page here. So Genesis 1:26. Then God said, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let them rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the sky and over the cattle and all the earth, over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the sky and over every living thing that moves on the earth. Then God said, behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the surface of all the earth, and every tree which has fruit yielding seed, it shall be food for you. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the sky, and to everything that moves on the earth which has life, I have given every green plant for food. It was so. God saw all that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. So, narrow to broad first, let me explain to you why I would only deal with those 5 verses. One, I can textually show that it is a unique piece of the literary movement. So if you are reading along, in verse 25, God made the beasts of the earth, and God saw that it was good. In Genesis 1, God saw that it was good is an ender for the days. That's a nice wrap up for everything that God is doing. So it segments the text for you. And again, in verse 31, God saw all that he made, and behold, it was very good. So if 25 ends with, and it was good, and verse 31 is, behold, it was very good, there is a text segmentation there. Also, he's creating a new thing. God said, let us make man in our image. Well, verse 24 was a speech, let the earth bring forth living creatures. Then 25, a description of that. So 26, it's a new spoken creation event. So things like that will give you an indication that a new movement is happening in the storyline or whatever type of text you're looking at. So read sensitive to those changes in the text. So let us make man in our own image. So once you have that text selected, be careful on what you're bringing into that. So you see on my slide, the Old Testament passages, Genesis 5, 1-2 and 9-6. And those passages are really just references to man in God's image, especially 9-6, just says the man who is made in the image of God. Psalm 8, verses 3-8, is another passage where it talks about what is man that you would think of him? He was made a little lower than the angels, but above the creatures of the earth. So that may be semi-related, but those passages are not necessarily one-to-one with what's happening in Genesis 1:26-31. In the same way, be careful about bringing in the New Testament. So 1 Corinthians 11:7 or James 3:9, both of those are actually talking about being made in the image of God and man falling short of the image of God. And then 2 Corinthians and Colossians, it is Christ who is made in the image of God. Well, not made, sorry for my heresy. It is Christ who is in the perfect image of God, uncreated, but in the perfect image of God. Well, those are way far afield from what is happening in Genesis 1:26. Just because they say, let us make man in our own image in Genesis 1, there is nothing about falling short of this image of God. So First Corinthians and James are somehow related. I don't know. In the same way, there's nothing about the Messiah. I mean, even the serpent will bite at the heel, but the offspring will crush his head. That's not for another 2 chapters. So Christology would be pretty hard to read into this. So be careful on bringing those in. In the same way, if you start bringing in things like that, or you start looking at your broader theology or your systematic theology of what does imago Dei mean, right? What is the image of God? Is that something inherent? Is that something that we are developed with? What does that mean? You might miss what is happening in Genesis 1 because Genesis 1 has its own story to tell, and not every theological point is found in every text. And not every text that has a similar phrase relates to all the other texts with that phrase, specifically in the New Testament. But I think those Old Testament passages are a little bit different from the Genesis 1 passage. So, for example, if you start reading into all of these other let's make man in our image things, you might miss the connection that's happening in this passage between dominion and image. So, like 26, let us make man our image and let them rule over the fish of the sea, birds of the sky, etc. And then 27, God created man in his own image. And then 28, he said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish of the sea, birds of the air, etc. So there seems to be a connection between man in God's image and ruling over the earth. Well, the man in God's image and falling short of that image may not be in the Corinthians and James passage. And the Corinthian and Colossians passage, Christ, I guess there's a dominion aspect, but that doesn't really seem to be at play. And then the other ones in Genesis and Psalms do not emphasize the dominion versus image of God the same way. So, all that to say, focus on the passage. You can bring those in later, but make sure you're focusing on that passage first before going to anything else. Number 2, always, always, always prove your claim. So I'm giving an example, and this is kind of an easy one to beat up on. I know that, but I want something that's clear and easy for me to critique. We do this in much more subtle ways than this, hopefully. So Genesis 1:26 uses a plural pronoun. So it means God is Trinity. I can tell you it is a plural pronoun. Then God said, let us make man in our image according to our likeness. This is a really old argument, and perhaps it is good theology, right? I mean, Trinity is found all over the Bible, but does the text say this? So the question becomes not whether Trinity is biblical, but whether Trinity is in view in Genesis 1:26 through 31. That is the question you need to ask. So pull it actually out of that text, not just from other texts that say image of God or other texts that say God is a plurality. Pull it directly from this text. Do other scholars say this? Look at your commentaries or your articles or books on Genesis 1. Are other scholars interpreting Genesis 1:26 this way? If they are not, it may be time to question if you're right. And then, are there other indicators in this passage for this reading? Remembering to stay narrow. Remembering not to look further on multiple chapters in Genesis or to look at the very beginning of Genesis. Look only at 26 through 31. Are there indicators in this segment for that reading? If there are none, it may not be something you want to touch on. Every interpretation must be argued. And here's why I say indicators in this passage. So if you want to claim that, you then have to deal with singular pronouns, right? So you can look at 26, let us make man in our image. But then verse 27, God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. So you then have to deal with that. You can't look just at the one or two times where there's a plural pronoun and ignore the singular. And maybe the singular pronouns are what makes you realize, oh, it's not clearly Trinitarian in this passage at all. Maybe I shouldn't make that claim. I can think that might be a possibility, but I don't want to go and step out on that limb because this passage isn't clear about it. So make sure you're always proving your claim. Make sure you're looking at the details of the passage and you're looking what other scholars are saying about that passage to support your reading. Number 3, and like I said, this is a style thing. Don't overcite, don't undercite. So here's an example of a sentence that's a little more simple than what most of your sentences are going to be, but space constraints. So God created the world in 6 days, Genesis 1, and then he planted a garden, Genesis 2:8. But it was all ruined by Adam and Eve, Genesis 3:1-7. So multiple citations are really hard to read, especially when they're in the middle of a sentence like that. They're also unnecessary if you're dealing with a continuous passage, in this case, Genesis 1-3. So thinking of how your reader is looking at your phrase, when you continuously throw in these parenthetical citations, it is disruptive. You read the sentence and all of a sudden you're thrown off by this citation and you forget where you are and have to start all over again, right? It can take you a couple reads to just put the whole sentence together. So a more simplified example that I put, God created the world in 6 days and he planted a garden, but it was all ruined by Adam and Eve. Genesis 1-3. I could be more specific and say like Genesis 1-3 verse 7 if I wanted to do so, or I could do it all with commas, right? Genesis 1, 2:8, 3, 1-7. The point being, it's at the end of the sentence so that it's easier on your eyes to read. Continuing with the don't overcite or undercite. Citation should be at the end of the sentence. There's one from Galatians. I was having a Galatians day when I wrote this. You can see I just separated them all by commas in that case to get specific verses instead of a full range. Now, I also put a subheading saying, unless they're different books. Now, you can cite them all at the end if they're different books, but let's say you have a list. So you want to say 5 different things that all come from a different book. And you could be like, the good qualities are all explained by Paul. So you have a colon, love, Galatians 1, hatred, Genesis 3. I know that wasn't written by Paul, nor is it actually in Genesis 3. Hatred, Genesis 3. Bitterness, Exodus 5. You can put those into your series because it's only a list. There's not a lot of syntax in a list, right? It's just a series of items. And if they're different books, that may be worthwhile. If it is just one book, still put it all at the end. If it's a sentence with fairly complex syntax, even if they're different books, 9 times out of 10, I would recommend put them at the end. So another part of don't overcite, don't undercite, a paragraph about one chapter or verse does not need a citation every sentence. Cite it, discuss it, cite the next passage. I also have at the bottom, do not omit citations when necessary. Make it easy to read, but also make it well supported. So let's say you are working your way through the Genesis passage and you're talking about Genesis 1:26, verse 26. So the beginning of your paragraph says Genesis 1:26 talks about God creating man in his image. And then the rest of your paragraph is strictly about verse 26. You don't necessarily need to put that at the end of every sentence. So long as you aren't switching to other verses and other chapters, we all know that paragraph is about Genesis 1:26 because you said it at the top. Now, if you start a new paragraph, you need to recite. So your next paragraph, even if it's still about Genesis 1:26, you need to say that you're continuing to talk about 126 in your second paragraph. So cite it, discuss it, cite the next passage, or if you're in a new paragraph, recite that passage. Again, if it becomes confusing, if on rereading it, you're like, I need more citations, or I even wasn't sure that I was still talking about the same verse, by all means, put the citations in. My last part, commentaries, your best friend or new best friend, hopefully at least a new best friend. Use them often. Cite them, check your understanding of the verse, use multiple commentaries. I will say, as I'm writing a paper, for every passage that I cite, I will look at least at 8 to 10 commentaries. You may not have to go that crazy, but if you only look at 2 or 3 commentaries, you have not done your legwork. Use multiple commentaries and cite them. I want to check my reading with a commentary every single time. So if I have a paper where I'm comparing Genesis 1 to Genesis 5, I'm going to use, for me, 8 to 10 commentaries on Genesis 1, 8 to 10 commentaries on Genesis 5, because I want to make sure that I'm not just getting one guy's quirky ideas about the verses or just my own quirky ideas about the verses, but I'm balancing between these different books. They'll be your best friend, I promise. And you don't have to read the whole commentaries, just read the parts related to the passage that you are talking about. So use them often, use the right ones. You want to use academic commentaries. So MacArthur is not academic. I don't hate the MacArthur commentaries, it's just not academic. It is good for personal study. It can be good for church or pastoral ministry, but it's not academic. You see my last note on there, academic commentaries have tons of footnotes and endnotes and reference other literature and commentaries. If you have a commentary that doesn't talk about the grammar, like it doesn't go through syntax and how clauses are related, or it doesn't say like, Johnny wrote an article on this verse, but he misunderstood the paragraph, or he misunderstood the syntax, but Jimmy wrote an article on this verse for this other journal and he was spot on, it's probably not academic. Those are academic conversations. Looking at syntax, looking at other things that people have written, other commentaries, other literature, they will have footnotes or endnotes or parenthetical citations to tell you they are academic and they are doing their research. The middle one, critical and evangelical commentaries. Don't use commentaries that agree with you or that you like. You may not love the critical commentaries. I mean, we're in an evangelical school. Most of us probably are not going to be in love with the more critical side. Even as the critical commentaries are talking about weird source things, they may be saying a lot of stuff about the Deuteronomist versus the priestly literature versus, the Yahweh source, or they'll talk about Q, this hypothetical document behind the synoptic gospels, or how, we all know Peter did not write 2 Peter clearly, right? You may not agree with any of that, and that background may put you off, but they're important to read because even the people you disagree with will help you to refine your thought. You want to know their arguments. You need to engage with what they are saying. Maybe not their source critical things, but their understanding of the verses. Critical and evangelical commentaries are a great thing to help you balance where your position is. Know both sides and be able to argue for why your reading is right and why the critical and the evangelical commentaries may be right or wrong. So that leads me to my last one. Use your commentaries right. Use their sources, explain when they disagree with you, don't ignore alternate interpretations, and don't rely solely on them. So I already explained explain why they disagree with you and don't ignore alternate interpretations. You absolutely have to address, if there are 2 or 3 ways to understand a verse, you absolutely have to address why yours is the right way and the other people are not the right way. You have to say that. Even if you're like, oh, it's only the critical scholars who don't read the verse that way. Fine. Explain why they're wrong. But there's one more level for these commentaries. Use their sources. So in the commentaries, look up their footnotes. Look up the articles they cite or the full-length books they cite. Those will help you dig so much deeper into these verses. And you may not find all of them useful. Don't get me wrong, there's going to be a lot of unique articles out there that you may glance at and realize not useful at all. But look at them. They'll be very helpful for you. The more background you have in the conversations happening on the Bible, the better you'll understand the biblical text you're working with. Use their sources. Use the commentaries, use the sources from the commentaries, and it can send you on a long train of academic reading that can open your mind to the possibilities in that verse. The last one, don't rely solely on them. As much as you don't want to do an exegesis where you only cite the Bible, you don't want to do an exegesis where you never cite the Bible. Most of us are probably not in danger of that. We know we need to cite the Bible, but I still just want to say it. Don't just only cite the Bible and don't ignore the Bible. The Bible is your base, and that is what you're explaining, but use all the resources at your disposal to explain that text. Don't assume you're reading. Don't just work your way through the verse and come to the conclusion. Engage with the commentaries. And don't just engage with commentaries, engage with the full-length books that are written on specific passages. Engage with articles that talk about certain verses or certain themes in that passage. Look all around to get a broad range of views so that you can better understand that biblical text you're trying to explain. So, commentaries, they are your best friend. They can be the broad level overview that will lead you in to what the passage means and how to get further information on how scholars are wrestling with that passage. So that is where I will stop. Here's our resources page again. So sbtswriting.squarespace.com/general resources. Those are the two PDFs I would definitely recommend. The manual style is always a good recommendation, but please take a look at Bible references and translation for the specific style requirements for citing the Bible, quoting the Bible, abbreviating the Bible. Thank you for listening, and good luck on all of your writing and exegesis papers.